So who are the Western Sephardim? That is the topic that we're going to be exploring over the course of these 5 lectures. When we say who are they, historically, who are they? Ideologically, what was their beliefs religiously, about their practices. These are all the different kinds of things we can mean when we say who are the Western Sephardim. Now, of course, by the Western Sephardim, I mean what we call locally, right, kind of in parlance, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, because of course that's how a synagogue like Bevis Marks was known, as the Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation, right? But in more academic language, they refer to that community, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the SNP, as it were, as the Western Sephardim. And so we're going to be looking at this question specifically of who are the Western Sephardim in this series from the historic perspective, right? Kind of looking at the historic context, the historic series of events, right? Their story that lay the groundwork for who the Western Sephardim are, who they become. Now, I say that, and that's really the objective of this course, is to focus on the Western Sephardim, the S&P Jews, because when we use the term Sephardi in general, it evokes many different communities, right, who all have, and some even who don't, but let's even just refer to those that do, that all have a connection to what we mean when we say Sfarad, and we'll talk about this, but when we talk about the Spanish Jews. And that's Jews who we think of as being associated with North Africa, with the Middle East, with what we might kind of think of as the northeastern part of the Mediterranean, places like Greece and maybe even a bit of Venice, and over to the Turkish areas, Syria, right? All of those we refer to as Sephardi Jews. So when we talk about the Western Sephardi Jews, we tend to be talking about a group of people who we generally associate with Western Europe and the Americas, right? That group of Sephardi Jews. But as we'll see in this course, it's not only about where they ended up that distinguishes between these various Sephardi communities. It's also about the context that brought them to settle in those different geographic areas, or the period of time when they emigrated to those areas, that all play a role in the story and the identity and the culture of those different Sephardi communities. And so our course is going to cover the story of the Western Sephardim. Particularly tonight is going to refer to the period that is, shall we say, shared by all of these Sephardi communities. And as we make our way forward in time, it's going to become less relevant to different Sephardi diasporas and will be unique to the Western Sephardi community. And it will help kind of understand the kind of the cultural experience of this particular group of Sephardim that ultimately contributed to who they became as the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, right? The S&P, right? The Sephardi Jews who end up in Western Europe and end up in the Americas. And so this course is going to be kind of this wide sweep of history. We're going to cover, nearly 1,000 years over the period of this course. And that's really the idea, is to give us the opportunity to have this broader context to understand the Western Sephardi Jews. And then this course, I hope, will create a framework through which we then will have other courses that will look at specifically at the Western Sephardi community, maybe about their religion, right, the religious practices or their culture or particular episodes that happened within the Western Sephardi experience, perhaps the unique challenges that they faced, and so on. But it's hard to talk kind of in detail in any of those ways without first having the basic understanding of their experience and of their story that help make sense everything else that we will then learn about them, in the months and years ahead. So this course really could have probably been a 20-part series. I mean, you're talking about a huge span of time, a very rich and complicated story, and as I mentioned, kind of many different kind of branches to the story. 20 is probably an understatement for the number of classes that it could be, but again, we're interested in a particular story, and so we're going to kind of, everything we do is going to be in the attempt or process of trying to form a picture of the Western Sephardi Jews, their experience, and ultimately, right, who the Spanish and Portuguese Jews are today. And so, tonight's class, we're going to look at their experience in what is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of Spain, or as I've called it for this class, the Golden Ages of Spain. And so we're going to look at the experience in Spain. It wasn't all rosy, it wasn't all perfect, but those earlier centuries where we think of, this classic, Sfarad, this classic Spain that we're familiar with. And we'll have opportunities during the lecture to pause for people to ask questions, certainly at the end for people to ask questions, and so on. So, let us begin at the beginning. Yeah, Bereshit, right? Jews come from Judea. How do they end up in Spain? Okay, we got to go back. We got to go back fairly early. So we know that there have been evidence that has been found that date some Jewish presence in, I'm not even going to necessarily use the word Spain, right, in the Iberian Peninsula, even in Roman times. Okay, it's limited, and it's not like an extensive kind of picture of what is, but we do know that there were Jews that made it. Obviously, the Roman Empire spanned the Mediterranean, and so it's not a surprise that traders and so on, right, would have made their way to various ports in the Roman Empire. Now, that being said, there is a pasuk in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that was seen, at least, right, retrospectively, as the origin, or shall we say, relating to the origin of Spanish Jewry, right? And this is taken from Sefer Ovadia, right, the book of Obadiah, where in the 20th verse, it refers to the exiles, and it refers to those who end up in Tzarfat, and those who end up in Sepharad. Now, we tend to associate those places as Tzarfat as France and as Sepharad as Spain. Biblical scholars are not sure that that is necessarily correct. It may refer to places in Turkey and other places, but at least over history, it began to be understood that Tzarfat was France, and that was where the becomes known as the Ashkenazi Jews, right, that ended up there, and a group of Jews, as it says, V'galut Yerushalayim, the exiles of Jerusalem, Asher Bisfarad, who ended up in Sfarad. And it was understood that Sfarad meant the Iberian Peninsula. And so not only is this, shall we say, a link to kind of the origins of Spanish Jewry as being, kind of associated with the exile, right, that happens, right, during Roman times, or over Jewish history, but even more so, those who come from Jerusalem, right, the royalty, right? The creme de la creme of the Jewish world. And over time, that would play an important part in kind of the self-conception of the Sephardim, right, that saw themselves as this kind of aristocracy of the Jewish people, right, because they were the exiles of Jerusalem, right? That was the capital city of ancient Israel. Be that as it may, whether exactly when Jews arrived there, we do know that there's evidence that there were certainly Jews there by the 7th century. There seems to have been, we know that there were various rulers over the Iberian Peninsula. In the 7th century, you have the Visigoths, that kind of make their way, the Goths, right, make their way across Europe, end up in the Iberian Peninsula, and it seems that that is the beginning, or at least one of the times, of forced conversions in Spain, and that there was a community of Jewish people that were forcibly converted to Christianity under the Visigoths. Okay. Again, it's a little complicated. It's hard to know, full evidence from something so long ago, but there seem to be some indications. It could be that eventually some of those people return. But again, at some point we'll do a course about forced conversions and things like that. We'll talk a bit about it, obviously, in this class as well. But again, there's limited kind of information around that. The story really begins when we kind of begin to really think about the Jews of Sfarad, right? It happens in the wake of the Muslim conquest, right? So as we know, right, Islam, begins to rise, and over the 8th century, right, it sweeps across parts of the world, right, into North Africa, and makes its way to the Iberian Peninsula, and conquers it, right, from the Christian rulers who have been there, and it becomes a Muslim-ruled land. Now, that becomes important part of the story because, of course, there have been Jews who have been living under Muslim rule in the Middle East, right, in Babylonia, right, what we call the Gaonim, right, the Gaonic period, right? And it seems that there are Jews who follow, right, and you find this throughout history. We'll see this, even when we talk about the Americas, right? We'll see that that there are areas where Jews live, and those who are ruling those areas expand into additional lands, right? The Jewish people also will follow that, right, seeking economic opportunity, and will eventually settle in those new places. And so we find in the wake of this that Jewish people make their way to the Iberian Peninsula, and slowly but surely that community grows. Now, communities also establish themselves throughout North Africa during that spread, but one group of them make their way all the way over to the Iberian Peninsula. And so it's during this time that the community begins to grow. Now, there are different traditions about this era. There is a story which was told by a fellow by the name of Avraham ibn Daud, who wrote a book that's become known as Sefer HaKabbalah. Not the Kabbalah that you're thinking of. This is the book of tradition, right? The Kabbalah meaning the received tradition. And in it, he tells the story. It's almost like a history book, right? He tells the story as he understood it of the Sephardim, and he tells a story about the origins of what we might call rabbinic life, or the religious life, or the organized religious life of the Jews in the Mediterranean. And the story goes is that there was a boat that was heading from Europe to perhaps from Italy, where there had been a Jewish community, we know for sure in Roman times. There was a boat that was making its way to the east to go to the convention, the rabbinic convention that happened in Babylonia, right, which was a very famous gathering that would take place there. And so that these 4 rabbis were making their way over to participate in this. Their boat was captured by pirates, as it were, not pirates with hooks, but meaning by people on the high seas at that time. And the story goes is that the 4 rabbis were ransomed by 4 different communities, right? And so one rabbi is ransomed in like Egypt, one rabbi is ransomed, I think it's somewhere in Europe, and one of the rabbis is ransomed to Spain. Okay, and so that's kind of the beginning of this idea of saying, that's when you start having, kind of an organized religious community. Jews end up in lots of places. You can't quite call it a Jewish community until you have a rabbi, right? And so that's kind of the story, right, of, this is like a functioning, community. As you mentioned, most people who kind of end up going to far-flung places, they're not necessarily capable of, you might get together to, have some culturally enjoyable Jewish food, but obviously you're not capable of, having a fully functioning community without a rabbi. So once they go there and they bring in the rabbi, right? So then you start having all the things you could do. You have someone who can make sure that your chicken has been slaughtered correctly, and the things that you need to kind of have an organized Jewish life. So that's this story which is told. And what's helpful about this story is what it reflects is the degree to which the Jewry of Babylonia, right, which we know was dominant, right, the Babylonian Talmud, right, that continued to be the center of gravity, right? So even though Jews had ended up all the way in, Iberia, the Middle East, right? Babylonia continued to be the source of authority for these communities. But that will change. That will change in the 10th century, and that will become a major turning point for Sephardi Jewry as what we might call a community that is independent, or a community that has its own independent character to it. And so let me read to you something that was written in the 10th century. So it's specifically from this era that I'm referring to, from a Muslim person, Sa'id al-Andalusia, right? So his name was Sa'id of Andalus, right? Of Spain, right, as it was known. And he refers to the following. He says, there were a number of Jewish men of science in Spain. Among those who took an interest in medicine was Chazdai ben Isaac, right, Ibn Shaprut, who was in the service of Al-Haham ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Nasser li din Allah, right? So the ruler, yeah. He specialized in the art of medicine and had an exemplary knowledge of the science of Jewish law. Meaning he was a Talmid Chacham, right? He was a rabbi. He was the first to open for Andalusian Jewry the gates of their science of jurisprudence, chronology, and other subjects. Previously, and this is important, they had recourse to the Jews of Baghdad in order to learn the law of their faith, in order to adjust the calendar and determine the dates of their holidays. Right? They used to bring from the Jews of Baghdad a calculation for a span of a number of years, and from it they were able to know when their seasons began and when their year commenced. Right? So essentially he's describing a situation of a community that was completely dependent on the religious knowledge of the Jews of Babylonia, right, of Baghdad. But it says that when this Chazdai became attached to this Al-Haham, right, gaining the highest regard for his professional ability, right, he was able to procure through him the works of Jews in the East, which he had desired. And then he taught the Jews of Spain that of which they had previously been ignorant. They were able, as a result of this, to dispense with the inconvenience which had burdened them. And so what he's describing here is some kind of process of independence that takes place among Sephardi Jews, that they no longer need to rely on the expertise of the Jews of Baghdad, because they now have their own expertise. They are also knowledgeable. They also have access to, religious books. they also have scholars, and they can function as their own independent community. And this is something that we'll see kind of throughout this course as you have Jews moving to different places, right? This process of first being kind of dependent and then becoming independent as those communities grow, as they have their own religious infrastructure, right? And they're able to kind of engage with their own authority. Now, unsurprisingly, this mimics what's happening in general Spanish society. And you will see this happening then throughout also Jewish history. We're very much, shall we say, a minority community, and shall we say, the way that the masses go off in certain respects, so do we. Now, in order to understand this, you appreciate when the Muslim conquest first happens, right? They are also dependent on, right, the caliphates back east. Right? And so they're extensions of those caliphates. But over time, those links will break down and Spain will become its own caliphate. Right? And that's, well, I'll just show you a picture here. This is called the Caliphate of Cordoba. Right? And so this is basically showing in the 10th century when Spain is now its own caliphate. Right? And so probably as being its own caliphate, it probably started having limited access to eastern regions, right? Because if it's his own independent caliphate, maybe you don't have the same amount of trade and people going back and forth. But also practically, it meant that this caliphate saw itself as self-sufficient, right? As being independent, of not needing, right, to rely on the old caliphates, of the Middle East. And so presumably Jews, in a sense, follow that, again, out of necessity in part because of limited, perhaps a decrease in access to engage with Jews back east, but also they're now living in a place that's well established, and so the community there over time becomes well established in its own right. And so it's during this time that you then have this great growth of Sephardi culture, that becomes kind of this prototype of what we think of, as these Andalusian Jewish traditions, and where you have this this culture that we think of as being particularly tolerant, right, for that era, right? What becomes known as the convivencia, right? This ability of different religious communities to be able to engage with each other constructively and in a way where there is a pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, and Jewish people are able to participate in that culture, along obviously with the Muslim majority, but also with other thinkers. There'll be Christians there as well, right, that will be able to participate in what's thought of as this kind of rich cultural heritage. Now, shouldn't think it's not like, modern day society. There's dhimmi status, second class status. I mean, Jews are not in a sense, but that being said, kind of relative to kind of persecution, and we'll run to persecution throughout this course, it's not that. Right? I mean, there may be pockets of it, but broadly speaking, right, maybe there's a very clear second-class status, but there is a protected status as well, and Jews are able to flourish, broadly speaking, within that environment, and it's an environment that not only, tolerates, minorities, but also it's also a culture that celebrates culture, right? That celebrates music and philosophy and science. And so Jewish people participate in those fields of inquiry as well. And so you have during this time this great growth of certain pursuits that the Sephardi Jews, right, of Andalusia are so famous for, right? The writing of philosophy, the writing of poetry, right? So you think of music, you think of religious poetry and secular poetry as well. Jews who become astronomers, Jews who become financiers of advising, the kings, even generals, right, in armies. I mean, really kind of fully kind of participate in life. I mean, this is pre-modern times. I'm sure, most people didn't achieve those status, right? But shall we say the advanced of the community, right, were able to kind of achieve these great accomplishments. And many of their works, the things that they produce, are still celebrated among, not only Sephardi Jews, but by world Jews, today. Whether you think of the poetry of Shlomo Ibn Gabirol, that we still pray on the High Holy Days, right? As key parts of our tefillah, of Ibn Ezra, of Yehuda Halevi, certainly we think of Rambam, right? So they're all coming out of this Andalusia, right? Out of this world, and it's a world that's familiar with Greek knowledge, right? That they've they have access to, Plato and Socrates and so on, and they're engaging with these and thinking about, how does, Judaism fit with these other philosophies, right? These other perspectives about religion and God and morality, and they are contemplating and engaging and debating, and they're also, like I said, writing poetry. They're tapping into that kind of aesthetic quality that we think of associated with that time. And so it's in many ways where we think of it as very rich and beautiful and exciting time. When you get to the 19th century and you have the growth of equality, complicated, but equality in places like Germany, right? So a lot of Jews will kind of look back to Sfarad to try to say, is there a paradigm here for how you can live as a Jew, not in the ghetto, and maintain your Jewishness while also engaging in broader culture, right? And the paradigm that they look for when they at least imagine it was done, well, is Sfarad. Scholars refer to it as the myth of Sephardic supremacy, right? This idea of, that the Sephardim had figured it out, right? And we should look to them to see how it can be achieved. It's a complicated narrative, which is why they refer to it as the myth. But it's certainly there's an element of truth in it, right? It's in most myths, right? There's something in it which is impactful, and so that's this golden age, right? That we refer to when we think of the this golden age of Spain. Well, things get a bit more complicated. The Caliphate of Cordoba will break down. It will break down as you move into the 12th century, and you have the era which is known as the Taifa, right? So the Taifas in Spain, where you basically have all of these smaller Spanish states, Muslim Spanish states, and you can see, right, how much it's broken down into many different smaller states, right? And again, Jewish people will actively participate in the various local governments in the places where they live, right? But it's no longer a unified Spain. It's not a unified, in that sense, even Jewish community, right? It's broken up. They're living in different countries, essentially. Now, this ends up, of course, as you might expect, as there being lots of tension between these kingdoms that are there. And as a result, you end up having, in the 12th century especially, as often happens when you start having kind of breakdowns internally within countries, right? That's an opportunity for invasion. And so you'll have invasions of new Muslim rulers from places like Morocco, the Almohads, who will make their way into Spain and will conquer it, or will conquer, as we'll see, at least the southern parts of Spain, and these are not the Muslims of convivencia, right? These are the Muslims of coercion, right? Who want to see everybody observe in a particular way, right? So it's a time of religious repression, and Jews are forced either to convert or they have to flee. And it's during this era, right, in the 12th century, which is when when Rambam, right, when Maimonides, when his family leaves Cordoba, right, and makes its way to North Africa. Then they go to Akko, eventually end up in Egypt, okay? And what's interesting about this, right, this is the beginning of what we think of the Sephardi diaspora, right? Before this, Sephardim are Jews who live in Spain, right? If you don't not living in Spain, you're not Sephardi, right? You may be Gaonek, I don't know. You're not Sephardi, right? But this is the beginning of it. And one of the sources we know for the fact that this is the beginning of a Sephardi diaspora is that Rambam, when he signs some of his works, he signs it as Moshe HaSephardi, right? Moses the Sephardi, right? And so he is self-identifying himself as a Sephardi Jew, despite the fact that he lives in Spain. The fact that he lives in Egypt, right? He still says he's Sephardi. He grew up in Spain. So that's his identity. So what you start seeing is there's being this, shall we say, it's being exported, right? Sephardi, right? You think of the Rambam will write in incredibly important legal code, right? And as you mentioned, right, the Sephardim were great halachic, great religious authorities as well. And so Rambam will write one of the most famous halachic works, the Mishneh Torah, and eventually that's sent to the Jews in Yemen, right? And they adopt it, right? So you start seeing that kind of the norms or the way that the Talmud, etc., was understood by Sephardi Jews is beginning to be exported to other communities, okay? And you start to see, shall we say, that kind of this broader influence of the Sephardi world. Again, it's not completely different. Its origins had been in Babylonia, etc. Obviously, it's rooted in the the same origins of all Jewish communities. But you start kind of seeing that at least the way that it's being formulated in Sfarad is starting to be exported beyond its borders, in part because Jews are being forced to flee and ending up in new places. This is the end of the golden age of Sephardi Jewry, or shall we say the first golden age of Sephardi Jewry. But it is what we think of as the quintessential period of Sephardi Jewry, right? The Jews of Spain who live under Muslim rule, right? That's kind of what people normally think of. But it's not the end, because at the same time that the Almohades are having their success moving north into Spain, right? Part of the reason that's happening is because there is successive Christian kingdoms that are successfully pushing south, right? From areas like Provence, right? And this is what's known as the Reconquista, right? The reconquering of Spain from Muslim rule, where that is slowly but surely taking place. In terms of kind of the years of all of this, just to help a little bit. So Toledo, right, which is, shall we say, kind of in the middle of the country, is already been conquered by 1085. Okay, so by 1085, you already kind of have a north-south split within Spain, and by 1248, almost every major city, besides for Granada, has been captured, right, including Seville, right, has been captured by Christian kingdoms, okay, by 1250, essentially. And so, the Almohades kind of have their time in the 12th century. Within a century later, basically, they have been defeated by Christian kings and have been sequestered into the very bottom tip of Spain, and they will remain there, right, basically until 1492, right? And we'll talk about 1492 a bit next week. Okay. This is important because not only do some of these Jews of Andalusia end up going south into North Africa, many of them maybe because the areas they were in were captured, or because they flee to them, they flee north into Christian Spain. Okay? They flee north into Christian Spain and end up living in places like Toledo. Maybe some of you have been there. You've seen the synagogues that they built, right? You've seen El Tránsito, La Blanca, right, as it becomes known, right? You see the synagogues they built. What style did they build those synagogues in? In Moorish architecture, right? They're coming from an Islamic world, right? So even though they are now building these buildings, right, in Christian Spain, right, that's the world they come from, right? That's where they've come up from, right? So they're introducing that, shall we say, into what we think of as kind of a Christian Spanish place. And this is the era that I want to talk about also, because I think it's really important, because this is also becomes a golden age, right? Jews do very well when there is, shall we say, sometimes a change in government, because, well, they're a minority community, and as you have a new majority looking to kind of reestablish governance, well, Jews were not the ones they were fighting against, right? They've been fighting against the Muslims. So Jews are part of how they, shall we say, solidify their rule, because then it's not only them, but they also have this important minority community that they also bring in to help them. And of course, these Jews all knew the language, right? They knew the culture of the places and the people that had just been captured, right? So Jews become really useful in that way, whether it's being the people who collect the taxes, right, or help with the governance of those areas, right? Because they're able to. They have the know-how, they have the language, right? They have the relationships to be able to do that. So they start playing, in that sense, a really important role. But we find that culturally, they play a really, really important role, because one of the things they become are translators, right? Because they are, obviously, they know Arabic. They're now moving into places, right, that these Latin-speaking places, and they are able to translate texts from Arabic into what will eventually become Spanish. And among those are texts that originated in Europe, but had been lost to Christians over the centuries, right? So you think of the reintroduction of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, right? A lot of that are coming because of Jews, right? The Muslims had preserved those texts during what we think of as the Dark Ages, right after the fall of the Roman Empire, right? The Dark Ages in Europe. Muslims had retained those texts, had studied them. Jews had as well. When Jews then are now finding themselves living under Christian rule, coming from from Muslim-ruled places, they end up bringing those texts and they translate them, and Christians are able to reacquaint themselves with these earlier texts, which is part of the story then of the Renaissance, right? Is this kind of reintroduction of these bodies of knowledge, and Jews play a really important role in that. Jews also translate their own texts as well, right? The famous Kimchi family is really important in this, where they go ahead and they take a lot of these Sephardi works had been written in what we call Judeo-Arabic, right? It was Arabic in Hebrew characters. Well, they're now living in, Barcelona. Their kids don't speak Arabic. But they revere, Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. And so they go ahead and they translate them from Arabic into Hebrew, right? So that it can be accessed by Jewish people who don't know the Arabic anymore. And so you find this kind of thing that then introduces these works that were produced in this Arabic convivencia context to the entire Jewish world. Because now it's not only to their kids, but if you're a Jew living in France, you now also can read the works of Rambam. It creates lots of tensions because, again, you're talking about Jewish communities that had really different kind of cultural experiences and relationships to different areas of knowledge, and it creates some really dynamic periods in Jewish thought. And what you find is in Christian Spain, right, in this kind of 12th, 13th century, you have development of new ways of thinking. So you have those who we think of as like those hardcore Maimonideans who say, no, we are going to hold on to this heritage that comes from this Maimonidean rationalist kind of way of looking at things. You have those who take approach of saying, well, maybe it's not something we're going to proactively promote, but we're not going to oppose it. That's famously Nachmanides, who's in the 13th century, who's in Barcelona, right, or Granada, excuse me, in Girona, in Catalonia. That's the word I was looking for, in Catalonia. And he will kind of take that middle approach, which says, it's the Rambam. Who are we to oppose, his approach to finding the balance between Plato and Bereshit, right? But we're not necessarily going to kind of proactively teach it. It'll be left to individuals if they want to engage with it. And then you have others who engage in the study now of Kabbalah, of what we think of Kabbalah, right, of Jewish mysticism. And that becomes like a really fertile ground for that, right? That's when you first find the Zohar, right? And so it seems to come out of this period as well. And so you have this, really kind of interesting thing happening where you have these, Sephardi Jews had been living in one context, are now living in Christian context, and they are playing a really important role. They're re-engaging within themselves in a lot of these ways. And again, you find the production of a lot of really significant rabbinic leaders, of people like Nachmanides. You have Rabbeinu Asher, who's in Toledo, who's interesting in and of himself. He comes from an Ashkenazi background. He ends up being a rabbi there. He becomes a really important figure for Sephardi halacha. I have a theory that a lot of what we think of as the minhag is actually Rabbeinu Asher, but that will be for further academic study at some point. Be that as it may, you end up kind of having this new, era, which is also quite, quite significant, and another golden age. It's another golden age. Let me see here. This is the world that they find themselves living in. And so you see here, right, this is after the Reconquista. And so you have different kingdoms, the kingdom of Aragon, right, of Castile and Leon. Down here you have the kingdom of Granada, right, that's still there. The kingdom of Portugal, right, that's new, right? And so you kind of, Navarre, right? So these are the various kind of kingdoms that emerge at that time. And they will only start to become unified again by 1492. And so again, that will be a significant moment. But while they are kind of engaging in this act of reconquest, right, Jews do fairly well in that environment because, and this is something that historians talk about, is that Jews do well when they are not the only minority, or when they are not the primary kind of concern of the majority culture. And so historically, Jews did better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule, because in Christian countries, there were no minority groups other than Jews, broadly speaking. In Muslim countries, they had a whole variety of minorities, and so Jews weren't kind of scapegoated in that particular way. Obviously, in Christian context, there's a whole broader thing about that, which is about, they see themselves as replacement theory, right, of Jews. And so there's a kind of a religious tension between Christianity and Judaism. But more broadly, it's, you have this very identifiable minority community. And so when in Christian kingdoms, right, they're battling it out with other kingdoms. So, Jews are fine. Once those battles end, well, then you have this very clear community that's different, that's amongst you, and that creates problems religiously or kind of in a variety of ways for then the majority culture. So that will become the story that we're going to have to look at. Next week. We've really looked at about 400 or 500 years of history while looking through these this sweep. And what we start to find, and these are things that are important, is that Jews are primarily living in Christian Spain by the 12th century, right? So this view of like, oh, Spanish Jews are in a Muslim context is only if you take a very narrow view of Spanish Jewish history, right? A huge portion of Spanish Jewish history is going to be under Christian domination, right? As I was saying, they've conquered all the way down to Toledo by 1085. They get to Seville by 1248. So you're talking about hundreds of years. Sephardim are in Christian countries, just the way Ashkenazi Jews are in Christian countries, which will be something that will be important for us to kind of think about as we go forward. But they were in this kind of very dynamic setting in which they were active participants, and that will be the story of Sephardi Jewry kind of throughout our entire sweep. Will be the extent to which throughout most of the time they're able to play kind of this immersive kind of experience within the culture in which they live. But what you also start to find is that over this time of history, you start having moments when these Sephardi Jews leave Spain, but they don't leave behind the identification with being Sephardi, right? And you see that with the Rambam, and we're going to see that more next week as we start talking about the difficulties living under Christian Spain. So we're still talking about the experience of most Sephardi Jews, but as we kind of move forward, we'll start focusing more and more on the unique story of the Sephardi Jews that become the Western Sephardi Jews.